Welcome to the Water People podcast, where we talk story with some of the most adept waterfolk on the planet. I'm your host, Lauren Hill, joined by my partner, Dave Rastovich. Water People is a place to acknowledge and share the aquatic experiences that shape who we become back on land. This season is supported by Patagonia, whose purpose-driven mission is to use business to save our home planet. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the Bundjalung Nation, the traditional custodians of the land and waters where we work and play, who have cared for this sea country for tens of thousands of years. Respect and gratitude to all First Nations people, including elders past, present, and emerging. Today, we're in conversation with Sally Parkin, founder of the original surfboard company in the UK, through which Sally has, quote, single-handedly revived the 100-year-old tradition of English surf riding on wooden bodyboards. In this chat, you'll also hear the voice of shaper extraordinaire and surf historian Tom Wegener. You can find his full episodes in the 2022 season. Here, Tom gives some context to Sally's contributions to surf culture at large.
Sally Parkin has changed surfing significantly, especially for me. She single-handedly brought back an era of surfing that had literally been forgotten by just about every surfer, or never even heard of by the vast majority of surfing. And it may have been the best era of surfing. Phenomenal. And because Sally did what she did, like, my DNA has changed. I am a different person because I found out about the UK bellyboard, and it just enhanced my surfing, and I think it's enhancing surfing all over the world. And that's what she did. She did that nearly single-handedly.
Tom, tell us more about how she changed your DNA, the DNA of your surfing self.
When I thought of surfing, I had a vague understanding of ancient Hawaiian surfing, and then surfing generally started in Southern California, Hawaii, and it was the 1960s. And then I learned that there was, Tom Blake and the Duke before then, but I didn't realize that on the other side of the world, surfing was more popular per person, per population than it is now. That an entire surf culture had evolved from 1900 to 1970 or so in a happy place, in a different world where they were riding little waves and having so much fun and developing the understanding of beach culture. And now I believe that from that, all that the modern surfboards, going from the Gidget era to the shortboard era to all the different eras, those boards were interchangeable, but the culture wasn't. So the culture of the early 1900s, for 50 solid years there, is what shaped our culture. And the boards are different, but the culture is the same. And that's the value of that incredible era of the UK through Europe, South Africa, all over the place. And even in Tasmania, in 1910, there was full bellyboard production happening. So it was all over the world. And again, it had been forgotten, and it's such a joyful way of surfing. And Sally alone basically said, no, this is not just a fluke. This isn't just something you do once a year. This is actually a very valid form of riding waves. and it's important. It enhances your surfing. If you have not tried a little wood bellyboard, you are missing out on such a huge part of surfing. Seriously, you have to look at yourself and say, am I a surfer? Oh, well, I haven't tried this yet. I probably should, because I will have my mind blown out of my head.
And that's kind of a new-ish iteration of the deep roots of what it means to be a surfer that you very much had to do with innovating, Tom, making sure surfers are going back, looking at the lineage and having diverse, rich, adaptable surfing lives with different crafts to suit what the ocean is doing. And we're so grateful, Dave and I both, that you have been involved in that work. And I see Sally's work as very much a kinship to what you've done in surfing culture.
No, absolutely. Sally's a monolith in surfing culture. Very few people have changed surfing the way Sally has changed surfing. So, yeah, you've got your big pros and all that, but then you have people that really make a huge effect on the foundations of surfing, and that's what Sally's done.
Sally, I'd love to hear from you now. We always begin the podcast in the same place by asking about a time or experience after which you are never the same. Do you have a moment like that you'd be willing to share with us?
I do. When I was 16 and we were at a family breakfast, there was something really important that I wanted to tell my mother. And at that moment, just as I was about to tell her, somebody said, "Pass the cornflakes." And I thought, oh, well, I'll tell her after school. But that day she had a brain hemorrhage and never recovered and died the next day. And so I never got my moment to tell her this thing I really wanted to tell her. And that's changed me for the rest of my life, that if there's something important I want to say, I always try and say it immediately because I think I might miss the moment.
Wow. I did not know that story was going to go there. I'm so sorry.
Well, I think I've learnt and grown from that. And then my sister actually got cancer the same age as my mother at 42. And she died, she had 5 years with breast cancer. And again, sort of having my mother and sister both die really young has given me a huge sense of treasuring life and not assuming, like I think a lot of people, that they're going to live to their 70s or 80s or longer. So I guess those two moments about how you never know when death's going to happen and it might happen really young I feel really lucky to be still here and pretty healthy at 63.
What have you done with that treasuring? What has it turned you toward and what has it turned you away from?
Well, I think the surfing has been a really important part, and it's also been a wonderful sort of memory or link with my original family, particularly my sister and my father, who also died quite young. Because when I'm on the board, I'm still remembering when I was 5 years old and my sister was a few years older. She and my father first taught me to swim in the sea. They were very good swimmers. And my great-grandfather was actually a competitive wild swimmer in the sort of late 1800s. And so I think probably I valued that more because they weren't there. And I sort of felt they were there when I was catching the waves on my little wooden board. So I started when I was 5. We were really lucky. My father bought a second house right by the sea when they were more affordable, and in North Cornwall, in a place between Newquay and Padstow. And so my sister and I were in the sea every day. In fact, we quite liked it if it rained because it meant there were less people there and we had more wave. And we were literally in the sea every day. And these were the only type of boards. I think probably surfers these days would find it amazing that particularly, although the Malibu boards came in about 1962, there was no stand-up surfing in Porthgothan in the little bay where we were until probably about 1969. I remember looking out from the cliffs and seeing someone stand up. But literally the beach was full of people with these short wooden boards riding prone. And that was surfing. We knew it as surfing. So when I sort of started my campaign to save the boards and was worried that they were going to die out, I was quite taken aback that surfers were saying, well, you can't call this surfing because my generation, that's what we called it.
Can we talk about the change that you saw in surfing culture from being a completely prone riding experience to being a stand-up experience? And why do you think the timber traditional boards of your home went out of fashion?
So to answer the first question,
yeah,
I suppose I started catching the boards or using the boards. Well, my father bought the house the year I was born, but I remember being about 5 when I learned to swim. He said I had to swim first. And so we were down there in 1965. And I said at our beach, nobody was standing up. They would have been, I think, in Newquay and some of the bigger beaches. The biggest change in terms of the wood boards, the prone surfing starting to change to the foam boards, was when these floatinas came in. And I think that would have been early 70s.
What's that?
So the floatinas are a bit like the Murray boogie boards,
okay.
But the early ones were literally just the polystyrene white.
Yes.
And my sister and I were really excited when we saw these new type of of sort of wavecraft coming in. But after the first time on them, we got these terrible rashes. And also I thought, I don't like this because I feel on a platform, I don't feel as connected to the wave. So I only tried them for a few times and they went back in the shed. And
Did it feel like, was it an inferior wave riding experience for you?
For me, yes. But to answer your question about why they took off and the wood boards declined, I think they were much easier. So the holiday makers particularly came down and they were more available. You know, it started flooding into the shops. I don't know whether they were cheaper, but they were easier to catch a wave. So the timing is not so critical. Unlike, I think, in other countries in the world, the culture of these foam boards has really taken off. So one thing I've been surprised about coming to Australia is you don't really see it much at all. It's mainly the stand-up surfing. But in the UK, it's still very active, the foam boards, but the wood boards had almost died out when I started my campaign in about 2007. That they, you know, I had boards and they began to break. After about 40 years, they snapped. And I thought, where do you buy them? I found out it was very difficult to find where to buy them.
I'd love to dive into the rich history that you eventually discovered and uncovered and revealed to the rest of the surfing world. But first, Tom, can you set the global context for riding prone? Like, this is a form of surfing that was happening all over. Can you talk us through your lived experience of witnessing those cultures?
Oh, sure. Well, when I went to the Bishop Museum and I saw the Aleyas, I went, oh my God, there's something more here. There's more to surfing than foam surfboards. And then going to Papua New Guinea years later to make Aleyas and wood surfboards, you would fly over and you'd look down when there's no roads, there are kids out there riding prone. And then all over the world, we find that there was surfing and prone surfing and wood surfboards. And that is actually what surfing is. That's the joy. It's when kids, I mean, there's a video I found of some Aboriginal kids, you know, black and white from the late 1800s up north riding prone on board. So they're just laughing and giggling and, you know, all through the Pacific. So it's just what surfing is for the most part. And before foam came along, it was very difficult to actually stand on a wood surfboard because the waves have to be just right. You need just those right conditions that are, you know, pretty perfect. I'm sure that all over the world that we're standing on them, but it wasn't normal. It was difficult. So, but besides, riding prone is much funner in small waves. Anyway, the waves overhead, you're angling across, you're going faster. You have that intimate feeling. I think that the Hawaiians even focused on the standing on Aleyas for bigger waves, because when the wave gets bigger, you're surfing sunset, it's 4 times overhead. Well, then standing on a board is much better control than lying down. And I think that's where the standing came from, because it seems Hawaiians stood only when necessary and rode prone when necessary.
So, Sally, can you talk us through why you started campaigning to revive this culture that you grew up with, that you saw decline, and what you found when you started that campaign?
Well, it was really because the few family boards we had in the sheds started to break, and I found it difficult to know where I would get new ones. And also just being in the sea in North Cornwall, I saw how there were only a few of us still riding these, and there was almost like the foam bodyboards had taken over. And we certainly saw more stand-up boards, but at Porthgothan, where I was mainly surfing, it was seeing the foam boards taking over. And I was concerned if you couldn't find them easily in the shops, you know, that it was going to die out.
Can we talk about the significance of timber wave riding vehicles and the difference in how they respond, how they feel, why they're different than a foam experience, a fiberglass experience?
Well, in terms of being the fun of being on these boards, as I said, when I first started, or I had to go at using these foams, I just felt I don't enjoy this as much because I don't feel as connected. I don't feel I have such a sense of speed. But later on, and much more recently, there's a massive problem in the UK because there's so many people riding these boards, and you can buy them really cheaply in the supermarkets, and they come down and they break sometimes within the first time of using them. And if they break when you're in the sea, you have these tiny little bits of foam going in the sea and the danger of marine life eating them. And even if there's hundreds left every year by the bin. So the local council say, well, what do we do? They're not very easy to recycle. So now there are organizations trying to encourage people to use wood instead of the foam, just from the environmental reasons. But I think there are reasons just in terms of feeling connected to the wave, and from having spoken to, talented surfers like Tom, my understanding is that if you want to stand up, that the way of learning to catch a wave is much better on a wood board rather than on a foam board.
Absolutely. I think that your connection with the wave is better and more thorough. There's a buffer. The more foam, the bigger the buffer between you and the energy of the wave. And you want to minimize that buffer. Basically, body surfing is the best, and then you add on wood and surface area to go faster across the wave. Another really important aspect of the wooden boards is you can make them yourself, and you paint on them. And everybody's boards in the UK have their own artwork on them. And so when we go to the World Wood Bellyboard Championships, there's hundreds of boards, and each one of them has their own hand-painted colors, designs, graphics. I mean, and they're hilarious. Geez, like one person gets a new bathing suit, they'll paint their surfboard the same color as the bathing suits, and they match. It's just...
So they feel more connected to the board, or personalize the board as well as the sea.
Absolutely. And the boards lasted, a very long time.
I love that, because that has so much to do with the real lineage of what it means to be a surfer and what surfing is and what our culture is. It's individualized, it's localized. Yeah, it's not this big mass commercial. Well, it is. It has become that. But I love this branch of the surfing tree, Sally, so much, because it is distinct and it's locally adapted. And I'd love for you to tell us more about your campaign, because we haven't gone there yet.
Yes. What really surprised me, and it started off in about 2007, I think, when these few boards broke, and I thought, well, where do you get them? And then I went and found the last person making them in the UK, and I asked him, I said, I'd like to order some. And he said, Sally, nobody wants them anymore. And he thought I was crazy. And I said, well, I think if they were presented in the right way, if people explained the heritage, if more, people are forgetting that these boards exist because there's so few there. Tom's already mentioned about the World Bellyboard Championship, and I'd been to one, and actually that was partly influential. I saw there were still people that loved these boards, but they were describing them as belly boards, which is a term I hadn't heard before. And afterwards, there was quite a lot of press about it, national press, because it was such a quirky thing. But there were lots of terms like belly flops, beer bellies, and I thought that's just slightly disrespectful. So I wanted to come up with a term that that it was part of surfing and that didn't use this bellyboard term. It's quite something for me to be using it now, 15 years later. But initially in the early days, I had a real thing that I didn't want to be called bellyboards. And I picked up from some of the surfers that I knew, that it was a slightly disparaging term, as if you're not part of surfing, these are bellyboards. And in fact, when I came up with this term, the original surfboard company, it was a way of saying they were originally the surfboards here. I was sort of claiming it back, really. And in the very early days, I met the surfing correspondent of the Times, who was called Alex Wade. And he said, Sally, I love what you're doing, but you can't call them surfboards. Well, that was really what started the fire in my belly belly, I've used the word, but that's what really triggered me to look at the history and go back and find my evidence that it was called surfing, and almost being told that I couldn't call it surfing and I had to call it bellyboarding was really what inspired me to look at the history. What really surprised me is I had thought that these boards had sort of come into the UK or been developed in the 50s. What amazed me was that actually it went back, now a century, to 1920s, and that they'd come in the 20s. But I got completely absorbed in trying to find the history.
And not only did they exist, but you've brought a bunch of beautiful printout photos of paintings from your region, and the waves are completely filled with people riding timber boards. Like it didn't just exist, it was a thriving culture.
I think, ironically, also have a lot to thank the Great Western Railway train company in England, because what they did was they were trying to encourage people to use their trains, and they'd worked out or heard that there were good waves and people were using these wood boards down in Newquay, and they commissioned amazing artists in the 20s and 30s to paint pictures of all these people having fun in the waves. And they say, go to Newquay, this is the surf riding capital of Britain. So actually, when I started my research, I found no mention, hardly any mention of the wood boards on surf websites. But where I did start to find information was on the railway websites, where I found this artwork. And then the artwork was often used for Newquay publicity guides, who again, they were promoting Newquay as the place to go. But the only thing that's happened, I've found that it's as if now in history, a lot of people thinking Newquay was the only place. And now I'm doing more research in North Devon and in Wales and other parts of Great Britain. I found that actually it was probably going on everywhere. It's just because of the campaigns that the railway companies were doing that they really just honed it on Newquay.
And are you doing this research just in your own time as a hobby, or is there an organizational body that's backing you up?
Well, I started off just doing it as a sort of individual passion, and then I met a few other people or linked up with Tom, and there's probably only a few other people in the world at that time that were interested at all in the history of these boards. But now I have links. There's the Museum of British Surfing. Even when I first met them, I thought it was very special that they didn't turn around and say to me, oh, these boards aren't any part of surfing, that they did accept that they were. And actually, since then and in recent years, they've asked to involve me and curate exhibitions. And the one I recently did for them, I was able to say this is a century of surfing. But I was also keen to make out that it's not just in the past, it's still going on now. And that was very important to me, that it's not just a museum of the past, it's showing that we're still doing it now.
You mentioned modern surf culture, kind of using denigrating terms around riding prone. Tom, we know, and Sally, you too, we know that there's this weird modern inclination for surfers to bag other kinds of boards that aren't the same boards that those people are riding. It's so weird. It's like being judgmental of other people's way of riding waves. And we know this from longboarding, how there was this split at some point when longboarding wasn't considered surfing, it was longboarding. Can you talk us through that and then maybe link it to when yours and Sally's stories collide?
Well, I grew up in Palos Verdes in Southern California, and we had the Palos Verdes Cove. And I watched older surfers ride the longboards. And so by the time I was 12, I just said, that's the way I want to surf. I actually prefer that. And I'd watched Endless Summer 1, and I said, that's actually the surfing that I like. Then I learned out Palos Verdes Cove was actually like California's Waikiki, and that Tom Blake surfed there and all the great surf there. And so that was surfing. And then, the foam longboards were an extension of that. And then when the shortboard revolution came and I was starting to surf while that was happening, all of a sudden the longboards were just, you're just thought of horribly of, it was basically like you had a horrible disease, transforming disease if you rode a longboard. And oddly, I was like, oh man, no, longboarding is going to become popular again someday. And of course, eventually it did, but boy, it was much better for longboarding for myself, growing up and being able to pull up at First Plate Malibu, and there'd be 6 or 7 people in the water, pulling up to San Onofre at 10 o'clock on a Saturday, and there'd be nobody there. But on the other hand, lots of people are enjoying longboarding now, so it's a good thing overall. But, I feel those are the halcyon days. So it's really weird how cliquey surfing is.
What is that? Why is the culture bent toward that? Because then it was like, Dave talks about being strung up in the trees at Burley for riding fishes, and that was not cool. Like, why do we do that?
I think, one, because overall hasn't been a social structure where in our day when we were young, just kind of the person that stuck around longest ended up being the top of the totem pole. where it wasn't really well socially engineered. Nobody thought too much about it. Where I think other organizations, they actually have a better, social organization. Now I think things are changing back to where the fathers and we actually respect the elders.
So you think it's about missing elders?
I think that's a big part of it, yeah. And without the elders, things become very cliquey and fashionable. And of course, thinking that, surfing was pretty primitive until the 1960s, and they were riding primitive boards. You hear that all the time. How could they have surf pipeline on these primitive surfboards? And then, the modern surf, well, wow, this is also so amazing. They're finally able to go into the tube and ride the tube, as we learned from the surf movies as they pressed us. And then the whole Alea trip was, well, actually, no, that they were riding deep in the tube for millennium there. And then with Sally, all of a sudden you find that people all over the world en masse were surfing and enjoying surfing. And so it makes me think of when the Duke Kahanamoku came here, it's, the massive celebrated event when surfing came to Australia, when the reality is Duke went to Manly to surf, and it was too crowded. There's too many people in the water. So he goes, well, I can't surf there. Is there another place? And they say, well, let's go to freshwater. So the mob went up to freshwater and he surfed there because there were so many, I understand, from Ray Moran belly boarders in the water in Manly, because there's already a massive culture. So you ask, why was the Duke so celebrated? Well, because he brought something different to an already massive, thriving, happy culture. And if the culture wasn't there, it would have been a non-event. You need the culture to support the event. And that's why I think this is so important, and why it's the culture that drives us. It's the culture that how we define ourselves is through culture, our own identity. And I think our identity actually goes into your DNA, and you pass it on generationally. And so that's why this is such a big deal, to understand your surf culture. And Sally's work, once again, brought that to life to us and opened up this 70 years of surf culture and identity that actually shaped our own surf culture, but we didn't even know it.
When did you two meet, Sally?
So we met in 2009 when Tom was traveling around Europe, and he'd heard about the World Bellyboard Championships and wanted to come, and he was over with Margie and Sunday and Finn. And suddenly the place where he was meant to stay, they couldn't stay anymore. So we had a mutual friend, Christian Bailey, and he called me up. He knew I was down at the family house in Porthcothan. And he said, can you put the Weganers up? I had actually met you just before. You'd been doing some shaping in Newquay. So I knew a few of the Newquay surfers. So I'd met Tom, but I hadn't met the rest of the family. But I said, yes, of course, we'd love to have you stay. So you and Margie and the children stayed the whole weekend. And that's really the beginning of our friendship. We've kept in touch, quite consistently over the years. And then we managed to find a way to come back 7 years ago. And now again this year.
The friendships that you gain through surfing are so unbelievable. And I can say, as being a politician for the past 4 years, you do not make friendships the way you make, your surfing friendships last forever and are so meaningful, and your political friendships are, temporary alliances. One point when Sally and Christian, and they sent a board over to me in probably 2007. And it was the classic UK shape with the lifted nose. And it was so flexible. And it was called the lightweight. And of course, at that time, I was messing with the Aleas, and I had realized that flex was everything. And seeing the boards in the Bishop Museum, it was very clear that flex was the defining factor of the surfboard. That's why they were so thin that you think that they would just break. They're so thin. And when I picked up that board, I just thought to myself, oh my gosh, somebody has already gone through this evolution that the ancient Hawaiians had gone through. Probably people all over the world have gone through. In the UK, they've gone through the similar evolution. And this is what I'm doing now, the evolution. So now my surfboards, I finally figured out a way to replicate that 1945 surfboard that was very thin and really flexible. So it's a re-evolution that is phenomenal. And it makes me just actually, once again, go back and appreciate the roots. And I just invite all surfers that want to learn, especially kids, to ride these boards, to get that feeling, to get that history, and to identify with that, because it's such a healthy, holistic way of imagining yourself.
What I still find hard to understand coming to Australia is why the wooden bodyboard culture completely disappeared here. And you were amazed when you came to England, to find the wood bellyboard champs, and it went up to sort of 300 people came along, and that there was this community of people still using the boards, although it was still very tiny. Unlike other countries and in the rest of Europe, it really has died out. So that was another thing. Maybe you'd like to talk about how much that's amazed you.
It made me how it just dies out without a trace. We don't know what a Willy Willy surfboard looks like. There is one black and white photo from a newspaper from years ago, and it's the only ancient Willy Willy board. We really don't have much of a description. We don't really know what they surfed like. That's gone. And if it wasn't for the Bishop Museum and a handful of the Koa boards, well, that would be gone as well. And in Australia, there would have been many, many, many of these wood boards, but they're all gone. And of course, Japan, when I went to Japan trying to sell Aleas, my God, you think you've had a hard time trying to sell something. Imagine walking into a big Japanese surf shop with a couple of Aleas, and the shop owner just comes over and looks at me and just goes, "What are you talking about?" So I asked all around, were there any wood surfboards? And I talked to the top people. At that time, I was pretty famous there with all the movies. And they said, no, there was no surfing here before the Californian, zero surfing. And so then Nabi, of a Nabi wood surfboards, comes down, and we're riding the belly boards, he puts it in Japanese and puts it on the YouTube channel, and all of a sudden he's getting calls from all over the place. And so then he starts traveling around Japan, and he realized that in 1830, the emperor suggested that all people go to the beach and go surfing, because surfing was so popular. And then you find, again, just like Sally had done, that surfing was a national pastime in Japan. And it was just all over the place. So all of a sudden, I'm hoping that it hasn't really caught on. I don't know there as much as here, but it's fantastic. And of course, that's why when the Californians came with the surfboards, surfing caught on like wildfire, because the culture was already there.
What I loved about the Japanese history is that they went out fishing. They taught, that was their work. And then once they did the work, they pulled up the floorboards of the fishing boats, and then their sort of reward after their work was to catch the waves with these floorboards.
Yeah, the Itako is actually a seat covering. Itako translates as seat covering.
That's so cool. That's good design too, right? It fits in, it disappears, and then all of a sudden you get to transform into your wave riding vehicle.
Yeah, and you get to clean it off.
Yeah.
In the Philippines, a board is called fafa. So in Hawaii, the surfing is called the la-la. Well, the fafa is the Philippine word for a board. And what the fafa is, it's a dinner tray. So when during the festivals, you'd come out with these big trays full of food, and then the kids would take them out and go surfing. And that was the fafa.
And functional too. It's getting a wash.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the design involved in these timber creations? We all got to hang on the beach yesterday afternoon with some friends and a bunch of kids, and we all got to catch waves on, Sally, your board, and Tom, your iteration of I keep feeling scared to say belly board. Surfboard. I'm just trying.
I'm more
since people
comfortable
can't
with
see
that
them.
now. At the beginning, it felt like a very important.
I feel like I'm
part.
tiptoeing around the word belly board the whole time.
No, even I use it now.
Yeah.
But at the beginning, and for probably about 5 years, when I felt a bit like the lone voice, and it was really because people were telling me I couldn't use the word surfing.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I would have got quite so obsessed with the idea that I wasn't going to use the word, and I just didn't feel it sounded very stylish. It was certainly being used, I felt, in a derogatory way.
Yeah.
But it really surprised me because I had no connection with surfers and the stand-up surf world. I just loved using these little wood boards. So I was really taken aback when people started being quite aggressive. I'd have my little boards at a stand and they say, "You can't call those surfboards, you can't stand up on them." So that was really why I had this thing about campaigning they shouldn't be called belly boards and that they should be recognized as surfboards, because that's what they've been called for sort of 50, 60 years.
But I guess in the context of a quiver now, a modern quiver, when you have a longboard and a mid-length and a fish, and then you have a little board, it helps to differentiate it as the thing you ride on your belly.
Yes, but then I think there are other words for it.
Okay,
Like,
please tell us.
bodyboard, wood bodyboard.
Yep.
And people were using the term belly boarding a lot. And maybe because I was jumping up and down and saying, please don't use that word. Now in the UK, people use the word slide, which I really like. So you go sliding. And what's been really exciting to see, particularly since Instagram and social media, there are now groups. Like there's a North Devon slide, there's a North Cornish slide, and people come along. So I'm so pleased they don't use the word belly boarding. And it links more to the Hawaiian roots, really, of where I think that term is used. But to go back to your question about how they're made or what they're made of.
Specifically, I want to talk about the noses and the advance of having that kick in the nose compared to lots of the wooden belly boards that we see around the world, which are just a piece of a tree, a plank off of something that they haven't been specifically designed for wave riding. Tom, go.
Well, the lift in the nose
Yes.
is incredibly important if the board is flexible because it's your gas pedal. Because when you're zipping across a wave and you want to go faster, you push down because it makes reverse rocker. And as your good friend George Greeno says from the get-go, reverse rocker is substantially faster than a flatboard. So that's why they were thin, and that's why the nose is lifted. I don't think the Hawaiians could do that because it's just really hard to carve that out of a tree to lift the nose up and to get that thin. But with steel tools, it's a lot easier. And so when you take off on a wave and you're trying to catch the wave, you push down on the nose and you get the reverse rocker. You catch the wave so much easier with a flexible board. And then you lift up on it and you do your bottom turn. And all of a sudden you've got rocker through the bottom of the board and you do the fantastic turn. Then you come up and you're in the pocket and then you push down on the nose and then you go faster because you're changing the rocker of the board as you ride it, which is so exhilarating. And it's something that when you're standing on a board, you'll never get it.
I think that's a really interesting part of the surfing experience that we don't talk about a lot, and that's building our sensitivity. Like instead of trying to perform something like pushing harder into turns or floaters or whatever, what does it mean to just stand there and to feel? And also to manipulate our crafts to be able to get a sense for, feeling when you're creating a different configuration of rocker through the length of your board.
The other thing that I'd really like to say that I think special about these boards, which is different about stand-up surfing, it is something that everyone can do. Like I started at 5, you start even younger. And I know people using them still into their, mid-late 80s. And it's very inclusive. It's something that you can share. So you can be a really good surfer and your kids, your partner can't come out and share that experience. Where with these boards, you can share it with anyone and you can do it at a very basic level. Or if you're a really good surfer, another time you can go out the back and use them as a really high level. But what I think is really special about these boards is that you can use them in the shallows with all ages sharing. And as I mentioned yesterday, we played this game where you actually ride straight into the shoreline. You play this little game, who's going to be, the furthest into shore. And I think that's very different. It's a very different sort of wave catching experience.
Please stay tuned while we take a quick break to acknowledge the folks who help make our podcast possible.
If the first 50 years were an experiment,
to prove that a business could be
responsible
and successful,
turns out it's not just possible,
it's profitable.
So what's next?
What's next is simple. It's human-powered, and it's finding the joy in doing difficult things.
What's next is turning capitalism on its head
and putting all our money where our mouth is.
What's next is unstoppable.
Thanks to Patagonia for their continued support this season and for prioritizing purpose over profit to protect our wondrous planet, our only home. Sanuk has been advocating for a more playful and inclusive surfing culture for more than 2 decades while crafting some of the comfiest footwear around. Thanks for your support, Sanuk, and for encouraging water people around the globe to protect their happy places. Learn more about Sanuk's partnership with the Surfrider Foundation at sanuk.com. Sally, you are part of a long lineage of women from your part of the world who are proponents of the wave riding experience. I'd love to talk about another one of those women, Agatha Christie. I was really captured by her story when I was putting together a book, and I came across this quote from her. Agatha Christie learned to surf prone in South Africa and in Hawaii. She not only became one of the first Britons to experience stand-up surfing, but Christie was also introduced to more functional swimwear after her ankle-length, quote, handsome silk bathing dress was ripped from her by the force of the waves. I wrote about her in the context of wardrobe malfunctions that most female surfers are privy to, male surfers too, I'm sure. She wrote, quote, almost nude, I made for my beach wrap. I had immediately to visit the hotel shop and provide myself with a wonderful, skimpy, emerald green wool bathing dress, which was the joy of my life and in which I thought I looked remarkably well. She also wrote, quote, it was heaven, nothing like it, nothing like rushing through the water at what seems to you a speed of about 200 miles an hour until you arrived, gently slowing down on the beach and foundered among the soft flowing waves. It is one of the most perfect physical pleasures that I have ever known. Yeah. You've done quite a lot of research about Agatha Christie.
Yes, as I was really excited to hear that she had been surfing. I was also very interested, particularly that she'd surfed on the wood boards, prone wood boards. And I was lucky enough to go to South Africa a few times because my brother lived there at the time. And one of the things that I thought was an amusing story was that she went to South Africa and there were all these people riding the wood bodyboards and calling it surfing. And then when she went on to Hawaii, they asked her if she'd been surfing and she said yes. And she was imagining that she would have a board like the British-shaped bodyboard. And she got a bit of a shock when she saw these huge stand-up wood boards they were using in Hawaii. But, you know, clearly she was a woman not to give up and she had a go and she mastered the art there. And I was reading this morning, she was actually there for 2 months, which surprised me. The other exciting thing I just found out this morning is I've been trying to find out whether she used these boards in the UK. And she spent a lot of time and lived in Devon, where I come from in the southwest of England. And she wrote in one of her letters that these boards would work very well in Devon, in Paynton, where she lived. So, you know, though there's not evidence, I think it's quite likely she was using them in the UK as well.
That's so interesting. And for those who don't know, Agatha Christie is the sellingest novelist of all time.
Yeah, she's third after the Bible and Shakespeare, I think. But it's incredible for me to think that this was in 1922. So this is now, you know, more than 100 years ago. And there were, you know, so many people in the beach using these boards. But I think that Muizenberg was pivotal in bringing the boards to the UK. So until I started to do the research, most people said they thought it was sort of chat in the First World War trenches between the Australians and South Africans. But in the research I've done and in the people I've been lucky enough to meet who have inherited boards from the 1920s, they say they came from South Africa. They had an uncle or a father who worked as an engineer there. And my thought is that the biggest link is with Muizenberg and that what was happening, because Cornwall was world famous for engineering, water engineering, that they were going out giving advice in around Cape Town. And then they saw these boards being used and thought, well, we'll bring them back to England. And that's why if you look at photos of the pictures in Muizenberg, they're exactly the same shape, exactly the same nose ride as the boards that were then mainly used. The very early boards, they went to coffin makers in Cornwall and they're more like coffin lids. But they obviously worked out when these South African shape boards came in that they rode the waves much better because of the little nose. So, yeah, I think that it was pivotal. But Australia comes in too, because in my research about Muizenberg, they started using these wood boards because an Australian in about 1910 visited Muizenberg and picked up a bit of wood and showed them that you catch waves with them. So there is an Australian link, credit too, I think.
Tom, this morning I got a message from our friends who were at the beach with us yesterday, and there was a picture, and one of the boys, he's 10, he is a super keen and stylish wave rider. He and his dad were riding a big foamy, and he was launching off the foamy, trying to catch waves, then like a step off on one of the little belly boards.
Yeah, we saw.
Yeah, and he sent over a diagram, as he recalled it, of how to make a wooden belly board. He went through each of the steps that he could recall because he really wants to make one. Is it an accessible craft for people who want to get a belly board but maybe want to have a go at making one in the backyard? Is this something that people should be doing?
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. I mean, it's so really
Can you talk us
easy to
through
do.
it?
Oh, well, paulownia is the best wood, as we found, because it doesn't absorb salt water. And it's pliable and fun to shape. So if you can get a couple of layers of paulownia, or even a couple of layers.
And it's quick growing, too, if you want to just throw a seedling in the ground and start growing your own.
Right, especially if it's septic
like
tank.
you've done.
7 years. Yeah, and you just place it down, and perhaps if you put, get some sand or a pillow, or have it bent a little bit so there's a little bit of a concave, and then towards the front of the board, a little bit of a lift in the nose. And if you take some epoxy and layer it and clamp it into place, well, then you're going to have that board. Or if you have a vacuum bag, even better. Any way of just putting pieces together with a bit of a form there. And then when you take the clamps off, of course, the board stays. Paulownia is very good. It doesn't slip. It actually, once you pull it out of the mold, that's it for good. Even plywood, just even a rectangle of plywood serves just fine without the nose lift. I mean, there's just so much. It's so easy to do. In Papua New Guinea, there with Nathan Oldfield, they said, "Oh, we're going to have a surfing display day." One of the chiefs goes over and starts whacking away at a certain type of palm, and they hand out the palm fronds to these kids, and they're really super floaty and light, and that's what the kids were surfing, and they were getting great waves.
Awesome. On a palm frond.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'd love to try that.
Oh, it was phenomenal. One of those little kids gets a keg, actually just completely disappears and comes out of the tube. we couldn't believe it. So then, of course, that's just what they do. They're such ocean people. They have that feel, and they start doing that when about probably 2 years old. They're out in the ocean, splashing around, catching waves with their palm fronds and whatever else.
You were asking about boards being made. It's been very exciting to see. Back in sort of 2007, 2008, when I was jumping up and down and trying to make sure these boards didn't become extinct. Initially there was only one person still making them.
Yeah.
And Tom was actually inspiration. You asked earlier about what they're made of. I mean, traditionally in England, we don't have paulownia wood. So people were buying sort of marine ply sheets, and they were cutting them up and steam bending them. And obviously back in the day, they were selling cheap. But in meeting Tom in 2009, I was really interested in using better quality wood. And Dick Pierce, who was this last guy who was making the board, said he wasn't interested in doing anything than the marine sheets, which fair enough, he was in his 80s. He didn't want to change. So I found a boat builder who actually made the board that I bought here. And I was amazed, even at my level of surfing, how different it was. So we were trying out different woods. And I'd read in this Art of Surf Riding book, which was one of the few books from 1930s that talks about it. They talked about gaboon ply, which came from Africa, being really good. So we managed to get gaboon, and we were trying different woods. And also, having seen Tom's beautiful boards, I was keen that the wood, initially I was painting them to try and get people's attention. And I did lots of bright colours. I did a breast cancer board for my sister. We used boards to be signs to promote, commercial companies they work great as signs because you're on the beach and then you're sending out campaign boards even. I did one for Surfers Against Sewage. You can use them as signboards. So there's lots of other things. I think that shape works really well in a way that a stand-up board you probably wouldn't use. You can carry them easily. And
it's a great table for a picnic at the beach.
They have lots of different uses. My sons even use them as snowboards in winter. I wouldn't let them use the good wood ones, but the basic painted ones you could use them as snowboards when we had a little bit of snow.
So what has felt like the best timber for you then?
Well, I think the gaboon ply, because we don't really, people now, what I want to say is that, initially there was just really one person still making the boards. And then when I commissioned the boat builder. And really for about 2 years, no one else was making them. And now I counted recently, there's over 30 artisan surfboards, as well as people just making their own. And there are now, I think the advent of Instagram has meant that people can communicate ideas. Whereas when I started, I had to get on radio or in a magazine. So it was really hard to build up that communication with other people who might be interested.
Yeah.
What I credit Sally for is going and finding the one person that was still making boards, the last of the last, who was 80 plus, and said, would you still make these boards? And she said, oh, well, Sally, the people aren't interested in them anymore. He'd been trying to sell them for the last 20 years. And Sally said, oh, no, I want 100. And of course, he just about fell over. And so she did that and began that campaign, on her own expense, completely alone, really. I mean, you had that group of John Isaac and a handful of people that were enthusiastic about it, but it was a very, very small group. And Sally really led the charge.
What a testament to the difference one person can make in the course of surfing culture.
Absolutely. And then to actually look at it and say, well, actually, I want to use the better woods. I've learned about Gaboon, and go to manufacturers. And one of the small point that's really important is it was during the global financial crisis, and the businesses were flat. And so she had the opportunity to go to these people and say, well, can you make these boards? They just want to keep the machines running. So they
had no boat orders.
They had no boat orders. So they were very happy to make these fantastic boards.
And then I went to, when she sadly, did lose her business, I then thought, well, where can I go now? And I found a company that made really fine wooden windows. And I said, well, when I was, well, can you make them for me? And also another time I had a marine company that did the interiors of like furniture for super yachts. And that was, they kindly sort of almost sponsor me, because obviously I couldn't afford to pay the price they were charging their sort of super yacht clients, but they love what, it was interesting to people to show, well, we're making these boards. But it was really, Tom, your inspiration of seeing how beautiful the wood was, and also environmentally, I wanted to stop using paint. So I think although it was a good idea in the beginning to use the paint and different paints, it felt much more right. People can paint them themselves, but so to see how much better, particularly also, we haven't mentioned about the lightness of them. And I had one journalist take one out who'd only been on the foam boards, and on a windy day, you're sort of fighting away. And also, although people have leashes with the foam boards, usually they often sort of lose them in the sea. But with the wood boards, they don't. They just float a little bit, and they're lighter, they're easier to carry. The journalist described it as a bit like having a neat handbag. You're walking down, and they're so light. When you're using the boards in the shallows, you're going back and forth a lot. So you're actually carrying your board much more than a stand-up surfer would, who's carrying it down to the beach and then it's pretty much in the water. But with these boards, if you're using them in the shallows, you're walking a lot back and forth. So if you've got a really light board,
even to play underwater is so much fun. Duck diving. Minnow was having the best time just seeing how far he could make his duck dive last underwater. It's such a different experience of playing.
Another thing going along with that, they're easy to carry. What is Tom Carroll, Tom Curran, David Rostovich, yourself, Mike Stewart, all the great surfers, what do they have in common?
Oh, one of those people doesn't belong, but go ahead.
What do they have in their board bag? They have an Alea. When I say an Alea, that's, the professionals that want to stand up on them. But, it's there. And of course, Tom Carroll is always riding his and, puts his fins on. No matter what the surf's like, he's out there. Yeah.
And if you listen to the episode that we recorded with Tom Carroll recently, we talk about this great sharing format of competitive surfing that he talks us through from one of Kelly Slater's invitational surf contest concepts. And what this style of surfing brings me back to, especially when I'm looking at all of these depictions of belly boarding, people with their little wooden boards. Yeah. They're all surfing together. They're sharing waves. It's a side-by-side, shoulder-by-shoulder, looking over at your mate, laughing, hooting, togetherness. That is such a contrast to the modern iteration of surfing culture that we see of one person on the cover of a magazine displacing the most amount of water. This couldn't be further from that reality.
Yeah. Well, I look at Sally and I think that Sally's never experienced, she's been surfing all of her life and has never experienced paddling out to a point break and trying to make their way into the lineup to catch a wave. And so when you have your bodyboard, your slider, you're on a different beach, basically. It could be crowded here, like Noosa could just be absolutely packed, but there's a corner there that's perfect for what you want. And even if there's nobody there, you'd be surfing that little corner right there. So you have just this freedom. You can surf so many more waves, and they're so much more fun. And all of a sudden, you're a new adventurer finding waves, and you're not even looking where everybody else looks.
The other important thing, maybe to say to stand-up surfers, that is really relevant, is often they'll look at the surf and say there's no surf today. And actually yesterday, Tom went out to check and left the note, surf's not great. And then we went out and we were actually able to catch some really fun waves. We were the only ones virtually catching waves in the sea. And so I think that's another message that would be great, is that you can catch waves. Sometimes it's about what sort of waves are out there.
Yeah. Well, my favorite thing now, my latest thing that just gets me so excited is you get a shore break, and when the waves kind of come up and pile up on top of each other, when it's kind of windy and it's a wind swell, and you're standing there in knee-deep water, and you're actually looking up at the top of the wave as it's a double, triple up, and you're looking at this wall of water, and you just turn around and you're in it and you're in the lip and you're just flying forward and you lift up on the nose and you land it. I think you did one of those yesterday, actually, where you just land it and your heart is beating, it's treacherous, and it takes all of your fiber to manage that. You have to be a very good surfer. And that's just, a type of surfing that I don't know many people really appreciate, is that just the heavy shore dump, how fun it is, and
it's
how much
so much fun.
But actually, Tom, though, I have to say, you don't have to be a good surfer.
No, you do not have to.
That's almost one of the points of think that it's great if good surfers use them, and you can use them at a really advanced level.
Absolutely.
But it's fantastic. I mean, they used to say, which I think is not recommended, you can even use them if you don't know how to swim, which is what they used to say in the publicity guides of the 50s. I wouldn't recommend that, but you certainly don't have to be a good, particularly good swimmer. You certainly don't have to be a stand-up surfer to use them.
Well, yeah, and when I was in Korea, I brought all these, the bodyboards, and we would go out to the beach, and everybody would catch a whole bunch of waves, because generally a lot of the Koreans, they didn't grow up in that swimming culture that we did. Now they are, of course it's changing. It really is the way that they should be entering the water and riding, going in knee deep and jumping into little waves and riding them and just working their way out that way.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that there'll just be an explosion of these boards through Asia, where the surf isn't that great, and you can surf a whole heck of a lot more days on these than you can on a foam board.
Well, for most places, really. Florida is the same. Italy. I can think of a lot of countries that would do well, and probably surfers would have more fun by having these little boards.
But I was surprised, going back to when I started my campaign and I set up my little company, the Original Surfboard Company, I was expecting to sell the boards sort of within Devon and Cornwall. And I was amazed and really excited that actually I had quite a few overseas orders. So I haven't quite seen it happen, but it was really exciting to see them sending out. Even I got an order from Hawaii, which felt like a real honor. But to see them, and also to find out where there are waves. So
Where surprised you?
I think there was one in Sweden was probably the most surprising. And Italy, I hadn't realized there was surf in Italy. In fact, there's a small group of people there that I met who are using the woodboards there.
Sally, you've done something quite brave recently. You're here in Australia. Can you tell us how you got here and why, and what propelled your trip?
I mean, selling the house.
Yes. Yes.
Well,
that is quite a brave
radical
move at any age.
Yes, the reason we're here, apart from it's a fantastic opportunity to see Tom and Margie again, was because our younger son came out to Australia in 2019, planning to just be here for a year, and got stuck here with COVID. And then because of COVID, his visas, or he got more and more visas. And then he met a lovely Irish girl, and they both want to stay here. And we've only seen him for 2 weeks last February when he came back to the UK. So we thought the only way we could get out and realise some cash was to sell our house. And so it was quite radical. So we sold our house, and we were able to then book to come out to Australia for a lot longer. So we're here until early February. My husband's a bit worried that we're getting through so much money, we might not be able to afford a house when we go back. But actually, as I was maybe saying to you already, I really love the freedom. It's been a tremendous release. You know, we had a large rambling farmhouse with way too much stuff, and we got rid of about 90% of our possessions, not the surfboards, which kindly the Museum of British Surfing are looking after me on my research notes. But yeah, so we were inspired to be here because of our son and spending time with him for a block of time. But also was very excited because it's 7 years ago since we last came. And then we had very short time because we were just here for 3 weeks.
She's a vagabond. You know, she's a real surfer.
Yeah.
You know, just saying, right, okay, I'm going to get rid of my world possessions and I'm going to go surfing. Yeah, you know, so Sally's amazing. And her husband, Henry, who's the funniest person I've ever met in my entire life, who has a wave. You actually witnessed him catch a wave.
Oh, the style.
Style is breathtaking.
It is. The speed, the unexpected spins and maneuvers and launches into the... It was... Yeah, you were right,
I think
Tom.
it's because Henry and I both are older than you, that we grew up doing this as children. And somehow, like riding a bicycle, you never forget. And it also brings back the fun and the memory. I've had quite a lot of people who maybe had left their bellyboards, but I've said the word now, but then went back to them and said, I feel like I'm 12 or 13 again. It sort of has a memory that brings back all those special times before. And as I said earlier, with my family not being here, I sort of feel they're with me on the wave because there's such a strong memory of, you know, we were lucky enough to do it every day in the summer. So for all my childhood. And it does surprise me. It almost sort of amuses me that, you know, because I started at 5, I clocked up, I've been saying, it's 55 years, but it's actually 58 years. And the other thing I'm very keen to say, people go out and they think I'm going to be really good. And I miss waves. And it's not about being good. It's about having fun. And I think that's really important. People sometimes feel intimidated or not going to be able to do it. But everyone will do it. Sometimes you'll do it the first wave, sometimes take a few more. It often depends on the wave, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just to circle back, Sally, to the story you opened with about losing your mom and losing your sister at quite a young age. How does that make you feel about... There's a chicken in the house, sorry.
Yeah, that's so funny. There is a chicken in the house.
The dog's seen
Intermission.
Pause.
By the way, we're at the Rostovich house here, and it's just this beautiful, beautiful old, I guess it's a Queenslander, but of course it was New South Wales, that they moved and they put it on stilts here on this very fantastic property. So this house has high ceilings, all wood, very, very rustic, very incredibly beautiful.
That's kind.
And they have chickens running around, and one just entered the house.
Sometimes inside. I wanted to ask you about how you think about the back quarter of your life, you know, having been propelled by losing 2 of your family members so young. You spoke at the start of our conversation about always feeling the need to do things as they arise and not holding back. So what do these last years of your life look like? What does it mean to not hold back?
Well, very exciting. It was interesting selling the house because I thought I might find that quite unsettling. But actually, I think it's given me an amazing freedom, which I really enjoy. I think the biggest thing is I'm amongst my sort of friends who are similar age to me in their 60s. I get to say, I really don't like the fact that I'm getting wrinkly or, getting old. And I think it's a privilege to get old. You know, when you've had, originally I have a younger brother who's still alive, but, my mother and sister died in their 40s, 42 and 46. And my father died at 70. And I just think that, I don't mind really about I feel lucky to have health, not to have cancer or any other disease, to still be here. So it's definitely made me treasure life. And I suppose the other deep thing to say, so I think a lot of people have an expectation of living till they're 70, 80, 90. I don't have that expectation at all. I don't go around thinking I'm going to die tomorrow or even next week, but I don't assume. And that radically changes my outlook on life.
Thanks so much for listening with us today. If you like what you heard, please consider sharing an episode with a friend. Our editor this season is the multi-talented Ben Alexander. The podcast soundtrack was composed by Shannon Sol Carroll, with additional tunes by Dave and Ben. We'll be continuing today's conversation on Instagram, where we're at What Are People Podcasts, and you can subscribe to our very infrequent newsletter to get book recommendations, questions we're pondering, behind-the-scenes glimpses into recording the podcast, and more via our website, whatarepeoplepodcasts.com.